Dirty Moderates, we who created this podcast had a very clear mission statement, and saving democracy was central to it. But what animated that impetus and that spirit and that reason for being, if you will, was the idea that we're facing grave threats in the United States, and those threats are internal. They aren't really external. Not that we don't have external threats, but we've historically had internal threats. And my guest today is an author of someone who outlines, I think, in great detail and an enlightening and an engrossing new book, the threat that came from within in our post-war years. My guest is Matthew Dallek. He is a professor at George Washington University. He is a prolific author, and his newest book is a must-read. It is called Birchers: How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. Matthew, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So let's go to the end of the book, because I was very taken with this. Now, granted, I'm showing my hand. I'm an Abe Lincoln aficionado, but you ended with an Abe Lincoln quote, which is from his Lyceum speech in 1838, which I loved. I love that speech. He was then a young state representative in Illinois. I think he was actually still a Whig because there wasn't really a Republican Party. And I want to start with it because I think it's a great way to go in. The last part of the book, you write, Birchers then bestowed to subsequent generations a fraught legacy, a politics of the street where armed militias, QAnon adherents, white supremacists, and their leaders lived in the spirit of what Abraham Lincoln once warned against. In 1838, concerned that mob violence imperiled the nation's fledgling democratic institutions, Lincoln predicted that the gravest danger to democracy was never going to originate overseas, but, quote, must spring up amongst us. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. And I go there for a reason. You know, we're in not the post-Trump era, we're in the Trump era. We're in the, you could say, I guess, the post-insurrection era, but, you know, given what we've witnessed in American politics in the last 8 years, roughly, since Trump came down that escalator, I always, as a lifelong student of politics and political history, would say to people, though this is abhorrent, though this is horrible, I can't believe we're watching this, this doesn't come out of nowhere. And though Trump is not a cause of it, he is a symptom of it. So I wanted to begin with that because I think it's a great way to get into who are the Birchers. And though your book expertly says, you know, we can't draw an exact straight line. I mean, there's obviously, this was not an inevitability, but there was an environment and an atmosphere that would allow a Trump and Trumpian-like politics to flourish in the intermediate post-World War II years and where we are today.
Yeah, well, it's a great opening and great question. So the Birchers essentially were hardline anti-communists, and the official line from the Birch Society in the 1960s, they had about 60 to 100,000 members. The official line was that it was really the internal communist threat that was the greatest menace to America. Now, you know, who were the communists? Well, Dwight Eisenhower, moderate Republicans, liberals, that basically most major institutions, including, by the way, religious institutions, had been 60 or 70% knuckled under to communist sympathizers or actual communists. And they set about trying to educate the public on a variety of issues. And one thing that I argue in the book is that the Birch Society helped to forge a modern alternative political tradition on the far right. And that tradition rested on ideas, primarily conspiracy theories, a more explicit racism or white supremacy at times, a more apocalyptic and really violent mode of politics, and deeply anti-establishment mode of politics, and a kind of anti-interventionism, a rejection, a repudiation of the entire post-World War II political order. And in the 1960s, many Democrats and Republicans alike were very worried about the Birchers as a threat to democracy for some of the reasons I think you can, guess based on what I just said. And in the end, fairly successfully constrained them for a variety of reasons. And one of the things I argue is that the Birch Society, even though as a group it faded away by the early 70s, it still exists, but it was not a huge thing like it was in the 1960s after, say, 1974. But its ideas, I argue, lived on. It was definitely not a straight line, but that, Trump and MAGA, Trumpism, bear the imprint of the ideas of the Birch Society. And that by essentially dominating, taking over one of the two major political parties, that is I think a challenge to democracy, right? A major challenge in a way that maybe we have not seen really since the 60s, 70s. And I think so hopefully the book helps to explain a bit of how we got to this extremist place in conservative politics.
Right. I mean, I think it's important, when we go back to how the organization started, you discussed it early in the book. It's 1958. I think it's December, right? What is it? 30 or so people gather in Indianapolis at this, a lady's house. The last name is Dice, I believe. But
Yeah.
I think it's an important outline for people, the way in which that immediate post-World War II, Cold War, Soviet threat, quote unquote, so to speak, really started to threaten and rhetorically and politically what it meant to be an American, and specifically, the paranoia that it stoked as a challenge to American exceptionalism and middle-class values. And as you put it, as the Birchers are, they are rich, white, and almost uniformly Christian, and that how this red menace would sort of foment a movement like this, right?
Yeah.
Because of, the movement has because John Birch is named after an evangelical missionary, and the movement has a missionary zeal about it.
Yeah.
About not just controlling the narrative, but really trying to change fundamentally the politics.
Yes.
So, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that era, because 58 also, it's after McCarthy already, when they meet, obviously, and we're 13 years after the war, and we're, in the late Eisenhower era, second term. So,
well, and going back further, it's roughly 40 or 50 years since the progressive era, and roughly 20 plus years since the apex of the New Deal, and a decade removed from essentially the establishment of the United Nations.
Yeah.
And you're right. The context is incredibly important. And look, the Birch leaders, there were a dozen who met early on. And as you said, they tended to be rich, white, almost uniformly Christian. They also did tend to be Republicans, although a number of them, including the founder, Robert Welch, a former candy manufacturer, he had essentially given up certainly on Eisenhower Republican Party. And in a way, I think in part to understand the founders of this movement, they looked on the recent past and their heroes were dead. Joe McCarthy was dead. Robert Taft, the senator from Ohio, anti-New Deal, somewhat isolationist senator, he also had died. And the party, the Republican Party, as well as the Democrats, had to them, for the most part, given in to this decades-long march toward communism, as they saw it internally inside the United States. And so to them, the greatest threat was not actually the Soviet Union. It was the internal communist sympathizers in the media, in the State Department, in the White House, and on academia, all down the line. And they formed this group in part as a kind of shock force, but also as a form of mass education, because the two parties being basically enthralled to communists, they were very wary of the parties and wanted to educate the public about the dire nature, as you suggested, right? This impending apocalypse, this and send people to see that the mission was urgent and it was moral, and because within 5 years the country was going to be completely communistic. And that was the sort of message, I think. Now, it took many forms, and some of the forms, the politics or education programs they ran, involved morality, campaigns against sex education, what textbooks you're going to teach in the schools, what books are going to be offered in the libraries, what magazines will be offered on airplanes in the seats.
Right.
And so it was a variety of issues, a constellation, really. But they went about making a dent in the universe in the early 1960s.
Right. I mean, I think that it's also important, and I'm so fascinated by this. I just love this history. You have, Roosevelt gets in 1932. You've got the Great Depression, then you've got World War II. And you have a seminal transformation of the American political landscape by nature of 25% unemployment, massive bank foreclosures or home foreclosures and bank collapses and stuff. So you have a new way of thinking about what role the government plays, right? And then by the time you get to 1952, when Eisenhower is first elected, one of the things that the right, and the Birchers fall into this, so they don't define the entire right, but we still see this, although the Republican Party has completely collapsed now, I think. But you saw Eisenhower and the establishment Republicans, for lack of a better word, reconciling themselves to the idea of a larger federal government, that the New Deal began to implement, and the idea that, there was a larger responsibility to the needy, and the expansion of the state could involve, which it did, the building of the interstate highway system and all sorts of things. The Republican Party platform was like, yes, we should have unemployment insurance. Yes, we should protect, believe it or not, protect Social Security, and, you had tremendous anger from wealthy industrialists just on that alone, that they would be stuck with, right, the idea of what now is regularly castigated as big government.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I think that's a really good way to put it. And that Roosevelt years from, basically 32 to 45 were really crucial, because to the founders of the Birch Society, the country, the United States, had become in that period and after almost unrecognizable. And that it had, trampled on the Constitution, right? And it had basically destroyed the founding, right? The founding ideals of a Christian, free enterprise, almost no government, no federal government,
Right.
and the freedom, as they defined it, of individuals to kind of do as they wish,
Right.
And without the government sort of having to put fluoride in the water, for example, and so that gives you a kind of sense, I hope, of the buildup, right? The buildup to the decades of really fury and rage at what the country had become. And so one of the paradoxes of the early leaders of the Birch Society, and even a lot of the members, because they recruited members, and they tended to be upwardly mobile and fairly well-to-do homeowners, educated.
Yes.
One of the paradoxes is that, especially the founders, I mean, these were, as I describe them, they were colossi bestriding the world's most dynamic economy. And they were incredibly wealthy. And they had huge, major industries that they ran. And yet they saw the country, right, that enabled them to prosper in many respects, as being fundamentally corrupted by communist ideas. And that, I think, I think is an interesting question about why, some, not all, of course, but why some incredibly wealthy individuals view the United States in particular as being so hostile to them, right, and to their interests. Now, on some level, it's rational, right, because some of the founders, like Bill Grady, he opposed unions. He hated unions.
Sure.
He was seen as staunchly, almost all of the founders loathed unions. But there is a kind of contradiction, I think, at the core of the movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and then I want to ask you, go to to change the channel just a little bit, but I also think it's very interesting to see an organization that is a forerunner, and we should say a not too distant cousin from MAGA and even the sort of Tea Party and stuff like that, formed before civil rights. Now, I mean, you're post Montgomery bus boycott, but you're not yet into the LBJ. You know what I mean? So you've got the anti-communism, you've got the free market's been stolen from us, and we're a republic, not a democracy, and this is all unconstitutional. But you're not, even though this movement certainly has racial animus and flirts with anti-Semitism, you're not yet into the sort of like 1968, 72. We're like, well, it's backlash time. We tried. You ruined the city. All that stuff that happened. We're going to the suburbs. So explain how, like, I think it's fascinating to talk about how a movement that sort of precedes, saying this loosely, race as a kind of overriding central idea to where we are, ends up kind of co-opting that racial politics to its advantage, or to its organizational advantage.
It's an interesting. The timing is kind of everything, right?
Or it's That's why I love history. It's like it's a different
historically and in politics, right? And you're right. I mean, it was not yet the kind of the sit-ins had not sort of taken a route across the South, and yet the movement, the Birch Society, I don't think it was an accident that it was established and that its growth and that the debates around it also came was coincided with the civil rights movement and the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education.
Right.
So one example is the Birchers, one of their most successful front groups, because they set up front groups, and there were single issue campaigns, was impeach Earl Warren.
Right.
And
governor of California. Or no, he's on the court by then. Right.
Former Republican governor of California, appointed by Eisenhower.
Yeah.
And one of the ideas behind that movement was that Warren was, through his court's decision, was giving aid and comfort to the communists. Now, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 was, of course, the most significant landmark in that. But it wasn't just that. It was giving rights to criminal defendants, banning prayer in public schools, right? There was a whole list of allegedly communistic.
Yeah. And Eisenhower sent in troops to integrate Central High School, Little Rock. That was to anger them, right.
So, the argument, in a sense, and this leads into the civil rights, the Birchers' argument on civil rights, I think, in the 60s. The argument, in a sense, is that, well, it's twofold. One is that federal kind of intervention, Supreme Court, Eisenhower, Little Rock, that is sort of basically steps toward communism.
Right.
But then the other thing is that the civil rights movement, whether it's the bus boycotts or the marches or Martin Luther King's leadership, that's not an organic expression of African Americans and some white Americans' quest for racial justice and social equality. It's actually a plot directed by the Kremlin. Now, I'm not saying every Birch member believed it, but there were spokespeople for the Birch Society, actually a couple of African American women who would go around the country giving speeches, the title of which was, "Is the Civil Rights Movement a Plot Directed by the Kremlin?" And the Birchers put up billboards in the South, in particular, that had a picture of Martin Luther King at basically a school for labor, organized labor and civil rights, but saying, Martin Luther King at communist training school, right? Saying, he's a communist. And so the idea was that, this is Kremlin directed. They are kind of foreign agents sent here to disrupt and even though the Birch Society was very quick to say, we don't accept members of the Ku Klux Klan, we're not racist, the conspiracy theory, right, the charge that civil rights was communist dominated was very much echoed by, say, the KKK's argument or the Citizens Council, sort of massive resistance to civil rights in the 60s.
Right. So let's go back for a second also. Who is John Birch? Why is the organization called the John Birch Society? And what did, or how does that name shape its mission?
Yeah, so John Birch was an evangelical turned Army intelligence officer who fought in World War II, was in China with the Flying Tigers, a well-known Army outfit. And he was killed in China 10 days after the end of World War II by Mao's communist forces. And there was, I think, a government inquiry into what had happened. Anyways, in the 1950s, long story short, Robert Welch, the founder of the Birch Society, a one-time candy manufacturer, got a hold of these documents through his friend Bill Nolan, who was a senator from California, very anti-communist, and wrote a short book, a biography of John Birch, arguing that, Birch essentially was the first victim of World War III, right? That, these communists had killed him, and that he was sort of this idealistic, true American hero. And even worse, that the U.S. government had covered up this monstrous crime because, people in the State Department were sympathetic with the Chinese communists. I mean, that's sort of the gist of the argument. And so you get this sense of massive betrayal, right? And also of martyrdom. And those ideas are really important for the Birch Society. They're important intellectually and they're important emotionally. This sense of reclaiming and defending, someone who was really the ultimate victim.
And let me interject for 1 second and see, to add to your point. I think also, so people who listen to this or who are not necessarily students of politics, the sort of Truman lost China, the charge the Democrats were soft on it, and that's in the late 40s already. Chiang Kai-shek ends up back in Taiwan and Mao takes over. I'm sure, right, that stigma, that association also fed into, oh my God, our hero evangelical, nonetheless, was killed by Mao Zedong.
Yes, and this was also, of course, of a piece with McCarthyism,
right?
Which McCarthy charged that people in the army were communists, that the State Department, right, was a communist in the State Department who were responsible for the loss of China or the failure to win in the Korean War, and so the Birchers were founded very much in that tradition, and were really inspired in part by McCarthyism as well. And in terms of, and so, Welch, I think, he appropriated John Birch's name, applied it to the Birch Society.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's really interesting about what happens if it had been named something else?
Yeah.
I don't know that. It'd be interesting to see alternative history. Would the group have had a different life or outcome? And I don't know that it would have. I mean, one of the insights that I think Welch and other founders had was that it was pretty mysterious, right? People didn't know who John Birch was. It sort of had this almost, kind of like you had to be in the know, right? You had to kind of understand what was actually going on to understand why it was called John Birch. because it was certainly not apparent just from the name itself.
No.
And I think that was a real empowering. It empowered people.
Well, you know what's interesting is, and I had never thought about this because I mean, your book is so timely, but I hadn't thought about this particular thing in relation to Trump and the Trump era, even though obviously he wasn't he was killed, so he wasn't a guy leading a movement. You know, this kind of grievance-based martyrdom seems to be a pattern in far-right politics, right? Not only that, but like, you know, that's one of Trump's major, you know, things. I say on this show all the time, the more indictments, the more popular he gets among the base. As counterintuitive and sick, you know, people go, oh, he's going to prison. I'm like, I don't think so. I think you should, but I said, here's what you got. You have your 2024 Republican nominee who is now running as a martyr. When Trump says, I am your retribution, I got indicted for you. You know, yes, the guy wasn't president, the guy wasn't alive, but John Birch died for them. And I think that represents, it implies, right, that there has been a wrong. That there has been, that you have been fucked and screwed. And I want to turn to a part of your book early on in the chapter God's Angry Men, where you write, they, of the Birchers, they fear that left-wing ideas, my God, this could be 2023. They fear that left-wing ideas had gripped U.S. institutions and defiled American ideals. I love that word. Imperiling the capitalist system and the moral values they cherished. Against that backdrop, the dozen men, in spite of their wealth and power, to your point, felt abandoned. This is the thing, the whole grievance, the whole we've been thing. They had been exiled to the margins and saw themselves as heretics. Okay. Powerful elites had betrayed them time after time, though they're wealthy industrialists, man, they aren't in the know. These guys are nomads in the desert, right? In their judgment and their frustration with the drift in society had been building over many decades. It was time for them to take their country back.
Yeah.
It could be MAGA's raison d'etre, couldn't it?
Well, I mean, you know, and look, when you're writing history, of course, you're informed by the present. But, you know, I also wanted to do it as history, you know, and be true, I think, and, you know, that's passage that you resonated. It does feel to me, you know, based at least on my reading of thousands of documents, right? And just the research, that sense of grievance was, and that's why I say that one of their core, it's really not an idea per se, but it's a mode of politics, is anti-establishment, more violent and apocalyptic. Well, what do I mean by that? In part, I think it means that the establishment has defiled the country, it has defiled the Constitution, and it has really destroyed what it means to be American. And so, you know, not to take the analogy too far, but when you hear Trump saying, as he did in 2020, as he's saying now, you know, with more of Biden, you're not going to have a country anymore, right? The country is gone, right? It's just not recognizable because these elites have been corrupted, they've been captured, they have stolen your wealth, and they have destroyed what we once had. And I think that is that mode, that idea, I think is, I think it animates the Birchers, and I think obviously to some extent it animates the MAGA movement today. Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating that Trump, right, who uses golden toilets and, you know, sits in a very, very and who knows his real cash position, but certainly he is a wealthy man and is the you know, embodiment, right, of down and dirty populist rage. I mean, with a glass of Dom Perignon, I guess. It's a little bit similar to this. You know, they hate the establishment, which they are products of, and the movement and MAGA, and you write about in the book too, we'll talk about it too, but the most astounding thing about January 6th, despite the Camp Auschwitz shirts and all that stuff, you know, there are those images always of the bedraggled guy with 4 teeth. But the truth is they were, like Charlottesville too, teachers, lawyers, postal workers, not terribly, these were not, you know, on the margins working class people, as it's often thought. They're people who are very much beneficiaries of the establishment they claim to load. And some of them had, of course, I guess, civil service jobs in the
Yeah.
police, right?
Yeah.
Or firefighting, or
yeah. I mean, they're good,
military.
solid. I'm saying is, despite their anger at what the
Yes.
establishment done, they are not without
Yes.
gainful employment, without benefits.
Yeah.
They haven't been tossed aside necessarily economically, which is so fascinating. How their rage is fueled, right, by the other.
Yes.
By the other.
And this, I think, is an important point, which I think gets missed in the conversation, which is that, when you say like Trump and MAGA and his diehard followers, I think a lot of people assume that it's non-college educated, rural, primarily white, and certainly he's got a lot of support among those demographic groups. Sure. But it is not, you don't win 74 million votes as he did in 2020, or do what he is doing in the polls just with that group, right? He has many people, probably millions of Americans who are college educated, who are professional, who are certainly middle class, and there are many incredibly wealthy people who support him and endorse MAGA. Look at the Betsy DeVos and her family. All the other people, Sheldon Adelson when he was alive. So I think it's a mistake now I'm not saying that the coalition, say today, is the same as what it was then. I think there has been some significant shifts, but you can see the outlines, I think, by the late 1960s in the Birch movement, especially when they're backing George Wallace for president, this third-party presidential candidate, whom sometimes people say Wallace is similar to Trump, and in some ways that's probably right. But you can see the makings of this kind of primarily white cross-class alliance that would benefit Reagan as well, but it also benefited the far right in the late 60s and onward. And I think it certainly is propping up in the MAGA movement today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating, too, when you talk about any kind of history of the conservative movement, not sort of the Bircher movement, but the conservative movement after World War II. One of the things that's been said a lot since Trump emerged, and by the way, I'm an independent. I was raised a Democrat, but I'm an independent because I guess you could categorize me as a political hybrid. I'm certainly homeless, and I hold some very clear center-right positions. But the thing that I find so troubling, actually not troubling, the thing I find devastating, actually, the moral and philosophical collapse of the Republican Party. And one of the things we've heard since Trump, and this relates direct to the Birchers, was, there was an intellectual strand of the conservative movement that was respectable, not tainted by this. It was spearheaded largely, but not entirely, by William F. Buckley Jr. at National Review. And one of the things he supposedly did, right, was eject the kooks and the cranks and the anti-Semites and the Birchers from the movement. And while I think that there is absolute truth to that, your book also lays out the point I'm making, is that, and how do you put it here? I want to read it, that the Republican Party and many respectable conservatives knew that there was a kind of strategic advantage to kind of giving a little aid and comfort to the far right, but where they wanted what you said, wanted Birch energy and money, but not the taint. It's this devil's bargain that, and now I coalesce now with a lot of ex-conservatives who hate Trump, and many of them are contrite about, we didn't think they'd really overturn Roe, or we didn't really want them to do that. Ronald Reagan famously said in the 80s, and you have to look this up at where it was, but it was something Bill Sapphire said back at the time. Ronald Reagan said to his core advisors, which is not unlike anything you see in Republican politics today, about the religious right. Okay. We are going to jolly them along. Come on, a school prayer and a board. We're going to give it, we're going to keep you in our fold. We're not really going to do anything. And so what ends up happening, though, is Trump, who becomes the unexpected conveyor and enactment of their ideas, is so unusual. But there really were a lot of people who, like you said, they got the taint, but they wanted what they could get out of it. All of this is to say that it just seems like you just couldn't have it both ways. They did themselves in, because there was no way to say, well, we're not going to deal with racists and kooks, But you have your 1964 presidential nominee Goldwater, who I don't think was a racist, but was a states' rights guy, and in the net effect was racism. You were opposing the end of Jim Crow. I think all of this got so messy and so incestuous.
Well, that's really been one of the, I think, central. You hit the nail on one of the central questions of really the past decade in American politics, right? Which is, has the Republican Party changed, or was it really Trumpian all along and we just didn't know it? How do you go from Reagan to Trump? Is it kind of one and the same kind of thing? And so, I have a theory of the case, right? Other people do too, of course. But what I emphasize is that the Birch Society helped to forge a tradition that really was in tension with a lot of the mainstream conservatives that you discussed, right? The Birchers, for example, hated Richard Nixon.
Oh, yeah.
And Nixon hated the Birchers.
Sure.
And, Reagan was not, Reagan was not a Bircher. He was not a conspiracy theorist, for example.
No.
He was much more pragmatic. He was a much more capacious figure than I think most members of the Birch Society were. But the question is, within this, what I describe as this kind of coalition that you hit upon, it was a very fraught coalition, but that, Republican conservative leaders oftentimes in their campaigns welcomed more extremist members into the fold, right? They wanted the money, the energy, but not the taint. But then when they got into office, they often governed in ways that frustrated the far right, what I call these Birch successors. Right. And that pattern, and it's not a perfect pattern, of course, but, you do kind of see it, right? Going back, at least in presidential politics, for quite some time, even when people like George H.W. Bush, right? Sure. The far right hated. And so
Gerald Ford, which I was going to point out, there's a fantastic, I had him on the show. Richard Norton Smith has a fabulous biography about Gerald Ford, I'll call it An Ordinary Man. And you could call this an interregnum or whatever it was. Who Ford was and what he believed bears no resemblance to the increasing rightward drift of the Republican Party in the 60s and 70s at all.
Yeah.
I mean, he was truthfully an old-fashioned Lincoln Republican in votes in Congress and in actuality. It's interesting. And that was, in the middle of this, post-Nixon, pre-Reagan, So.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And look, in a way, again, you don't want to read too much of the present into the past.
No.
But you can look at the 1960s and say Nixon in 62, and when he ran for governor of California, and he denounced the Birchers, which was a big issue. And the Birchers ended up hating him. And they took it out on him in the Republican primary, where he lost a third of the vote to the Birch candidate, a guy named Joe Schell. In 64 comes along, the Birchers really like Goldwater, even though there are tensions as well. Goldwater is also not a Bircher, I don't think.
No.
But, when Goldwater gets tarred as the epitome of extremism, loses in a landslide. And then Reagan in 66 kind of splits the difference a little bit, right? And sort of repudiates Robert Welch, the conspiracy theory about Eisenhower, and says, if any Bircher backs me, they're backing my philosophies. I'm not supporting theirs. And was sort of much more deft about forging a coalition, an electoral coalition that could speak to a much broader electorate, but also include at least some support from more extremist-minded people and groups.
Yeah. And it is the big question, were they like this all along? And as you say, you can't draw a direct line, you say in the book directly, nor was this inevitable. I mean, I would always argue, no, it was not like this, because the Republican, like any institution or party, was complex and sprawling and big. And, it's tough to argue that, because the Democratic Party's, southern flank is responsible for so much of the institutionalized racism. It doesn't excuse the Republican Party, but they just weren't. This was this perfect post-war nexus, right? This intersection, right? Where, the Dixiecrats are going one way, the Birchers are rising, but the other thing too is that the Cold War and the whole threat of communism masked so many of the fissures in the conservative or right-leaning coalition for so long that after you saw this explode right afterward. You saw Pat Buchanan, who I think is an heir to this, in 92 run, and then 96, all of this stuff. The Wallace, George Wallace, who was a Democrat, who really cost Humphrey the 68 election. Your point, Nixon did the Southern strategy because he saw he was going to lose Wallace votes, and like you said, Nixon was a Machiavellian person, if nothing else, but he was not a Bircher. And I argue he was, he was such a pathological figure, but so smart and so effective in so many ways. Yeah. You wonder, without the influence of this, might he just been a Lincoln Republican in practice? I don't know. We don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you make few interesting points, but the end of the Cold War, I think, is a more significant moment. It just feels like it starts to loom more and more important, because the Cold War, as you said, held together in some ways this very uneasy conservative coalition.
Yep.
And the end of the Cold War, I think, enables the older kind of isolationist tradition to gain more popularity and credibility politically in a way that it just could not do. It couldn't get that kind of oxygen during the Cold War. And you're right. I mean, if you look even at someone like George W. Bush, Bush was not, I don't think, really at all in the Birch tradition in many respects. I mean, he gave a primetime speech in favor of immigration reform, for example.
Neither Bushes. I mean, H.W. was truly a MAGA.
No. And the Birchers are, their inheritors, right? Their ancestors, their successors, they hated the Bushes, right?
Oh God, yeah. They hated the Ford. They hated the Fords too.
Yeah. No, I mean, so part of, I think, the grievance that you talked about earlier, is really a grievance directed toward a conservative Republican establishment that they thought, that the Birchers thought, and then I think other successors to them thought, was not truly defending the country in the way that they promised during their campaigns, and was not really delivering on the agenda that they thought was necessary to restore constitutionalism and restore the country as a true republic. And I think that helps animate Trump and the Trump movement.
Yeah. I know, absolutely. And it's also important. Your book does something else I think is really important, is in its history, to explain. And I think that everyone who writes history should always do this. It's easy with a book like this, which is so persuasive, to become a doomsdayer, and talk about how America's always been irredeemable and there's no resistance, when indeed there was. And you talk about Birch Watch and the Anti-Defamation League, very much like when people write about, the early days of slavery. Like, there are a lot of historians who will say, but abolition was there from the beginning too. It wasn't just a Lincoln thing. So, but talk about this amazing ADL, the Birch Watchers, because I think it's so important to know how that really helped destabilize them, and how there was and were many people, not just Jews, but people who cared enough about democracy to try to thwart the more nefarious aims of the Birch organization.
Yeah. Well, so the Anti-Defamation League mounted basically, it was out in the open, but it was also clandestine. A campaign.
I love Birch Watcher. That's great.
And sometimes they were called the counter reaction or the counteraction, self-protection. Basically, they deployed people to infiltrate the Birch Society, to infiltrate headquarters and chapters, and attend events and meetings and all sorts of, and get a hold of a chapter who was financing them, and credit checks on these folks. And anyways, then they would take this information, they use it to try to discredit the Birchers as anti-Semitic, as anti-Black racist, and as anti-democracy. And they try to do it in the mass media, and they try to do it in the ADL's own publications. Right. And one thing I argue in the book is that the ADL, even though they use some questionable means, were actually pretty successful, not by themselves, but as part of a much broader liberal coalition that included White Houses It included a mass media before social media existed. It included the NAACP and many other kind of civic groups, right, that had an attachment to democracy, or as they define, right, democracy, and a sense that they had to defend it, right? And they had to defend some of the threats, like conspiracy theories that they saw to the democratic order, and that they were able essentially to marginalize the Birch Society. They were able to tar it in the public mind as beyond the bounds of respectable politics, that it was too extreme. And that was a fairly effective campaign for a while, even though the Birch ideas, of course, never died, when I try to trace their afterlife. But the Birch Society did wither in the early 70s.
Yeah. No, they did. And I think that that's good. And the other thing that I think is so important is, as you see this group, Moms for Liberty, emerge now, is another group of just moms who care about their kids. You have a whole chapter on, what is it, Little Old Ladies in Tennis Shoes? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, yeah.
Talk about the role of women, because this is always fascinating. It's almost like the Phyllis Schlafly contingent or something, right?
Yeah, well, and Phyllis Schlafly, right, the leader of the anti-ERA movement,
right,
in the 70s, she was a Bircher for a time,
right,
for several years. So one of the things I argue is that, Robert Welch in the 60s became this really household name, right? He was sort of the face of the Birch Society, and his theory that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist agent, that was also notorious.
If you wonder where MAGA drew some inspiration from,
yes,
I mean, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, the President of the United States. I mean, Dwight David Eisenhower is a communist. I mean, you can't make it up, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
and it alarmed and outraged a lot of Americans when that charge surfaced.
Horrible.
And so Welch really, he appeared on Meet the Press twice in 1961 and again in 64. So he was really the face of the movement. But one of the things I argue is that, we sometimes mistake, like Welch was very influential, but you also have to understand, because he would give directives to his members. But at the chapter level, because the Birch Society had chapters of roughly 20 people all over the country, primarily women, I think, were really agents of change and empowerment. And they would take these directives. Sometimes they would follow them, sometimes not. But, they were often the ones who were hosting chapter meetings. They were, managing the Birch Society bookstores. They were maybe marching or going to meetings, holding up picket signs, doing a lot of the work, as one said, because, the men were at work and we had the time. And they also viewed this kind of broad moral culture war that we would call today, or this sort of broad attempt to kind of restore morality, traditional morality, they believe that they were equipped to bring that fight to the public and to bring the fight for the schools to the public, to run for seats on school boards, for example, or take over PTAs. And they were derided as Little Old Ladies in Tennis Shoes, which was a name a former California State Attorney General gave to them. And it was really a put down, but I think it missed the energy and the insights. And then the last thing I'll say about the women is that paradoxically, even though they wanted to return to a kind of almost pre-World War I a notion of gender norms and traditional values, they took advantage really of the second wave of feminism by entering the public square and entering the fray, right? They became very
anti-feminists who use the feminist trappings to advance their message.
Well, they were very powerful, very active.
Yep.
And they certainly, I don't think, took a back seat to the men at the chapter level. And so I think that's another interesting paradox of the Birch movement.
The thing that also, I think, in you talking about the organizational structure of the Birchers, and even beyond their years of influence, their animating spirit, you do see in conservative politics, in all the years subsequent to that, so organizationally precise, almost corporate, almost unified. You know what I mean? The years leading up to Reagan and after, and especially as we now have witnessed, in the 2010s, when the Democrats are focusing on everything national, the whole, and I always tell my Democratic friends this, everything can't just be about, well, in those days it was about Obama or it was about Bill Clinton and about the court. Well, your guys are talking about that and saying there's only one issue and it's only abortion, and I'm very pro-choice. Mm-hmm. Guess what? There are people on the ground organizing to take away that right to an abortion, winning school board seats, winning state legislatures, actually doing the work of politics, because I agree with Tip O'Neill, politics is local, and they understood that ground up approach. I mean, you see that now. You see it, even though I think it's less effective. I think you see a little bit of the DeSantis movement crumbling because I think it's just not selling. But I think you see Moms for Liberty and you see people fighting the quote unquote woke boogeyman and all that stuff that I think takes a page out of the little ladies with tennis shoes and the what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics.
Yeah. There's
don't you think there's an analog? I do.
Yeah. So there's an interesting moment where a couple months ago, someone basically told me that Steve Bannon on his podcast, The War Room, held up a copy of my book. And, I was really surprised, and I ended up getting a hold of the clip. And it turned out he was actually interviewing one of the co-founders of Moms for Liberty.
Right.
And he said, look, there was this article in The Guardian. It was in part about this book, Birchers. And, maybe they're comparing you to the Birchers. And he said, come on, is that right? And she said, well, on one level, she said, look, it's absurd. We're not Birch Society. We're our own. Moms for Liberty is our own unique group. But she also said, do we share some ideas with the Birchers? Sure. And I actually think that there is, look, the Birch Society had money.
Yep.
They had a focus on many local concerns and issues. So they were on the ground in a sense. They helped to politicize civic groups and spaces that weren't seen necessarily as partisan battlegrounds, like the schools then. And they had a lot of energy, right? They demonstrated that a small number of people can have a huge impact, far greater in sense than millions of voters. And I think that's true with Moms for Liberty as well, because, apparently a lot of the people filing these challenges to books, sometimes like one person over and over again who's filing multiple challenges.
Well, your book outlined there were attempts to ban all the books that they did.
Oh, yeah. And so you can see how a relatively small number of people can have this sort of outsized impact. One thing I will say is that I do think today, or in the past couple of decades, I do think that, conservatives and really the far right, I think they become much better organized, much more effective politically. Right. And much more engaged electorally than, say, they were in the 60s. So I think there are some differences, too.
Yeah. Well, and also the Birchers also, despite Eisenhower having those two terms, really reformed still in the era before Republican electoral dominance really became a thing. At least the dominance that happened from 68 to 92, excluding the Jimmy Carter years. Do you know what I mean? It was I think it was a precursor to that. And now we've lived in an era where we seem to be equal parts Democrat and Republican. But when I grew up, the electoral map, oh my God, remember? It was like, oh my God, Reagan won 49 states. Yeah. But George H.W. Bush won 400 and something plus electoral votes. You don't see that anymore. Where now power politics is much more at the margins. I mean, Nixon and, there were narrow elections were just, less common in those years.
Yeah. And that's, I think, a story that a lot of people have told in part about the polarization of the electorate, right? And the parties, right? And the ideological sorting out of the parties.
Yeah, no, it's true. So as we get to the end of it, I have two modern day questions that were brought to my attention. I thought we should talk about. One is, do you follow this Jason Aldean try that in a small town controversy at all?
A little bit, yeah. Remind me.
Well, just that he's a country singer, and I'm not that familiar with him. And he did a song that sounds like speaking of extolling, the small town and images of like the looting in 2020, and we'll take care of ourselves and we'll grab a gun if we need to. It's been accused of all these things. You kind of feel in that sense, that there's a sense of that. there's two Americas, and we're the America that we're the real America, and we're going to do it our way, and we're not going to sit here and go along with all this wokeness and stuff like that. As we approach, and of course the Birchers are not, a threat, but Birchite notions. I mean, the Moms for Liberty woman, I don't know who it was, they got an applause for Hitler line. There's a video, you can watch it, where the whole crowd cheers. It's scary.
I saw that. Yeah,
I mean, that's not propaganda. What would be like, if you care about democracy, and that includes ex-Republicans, independents, conservatives, people that want nothing to do with Trumpism in all its noxious form. Like, what could we learn from the Bircher playbook? And what would be an easily digestible way to say to people, hey, we got a challenge in 24. There's a lot of history here that's led to a moment this potentially devastating. What do you think? If you were to I don't know, if you had to, because you've written a great book, enough people don't read anymore. But like, if you were pamphleteering, and I hate to be so reductive, it kind of insults your work, but what would be the way to say, hey man, Birchers, MAGA, all this stuff really threatens democracy. These people represent a threat to everyone's way of life, including their own. They just don't know it. So
well, so I think Birchers, the history shows that organization matters,
right?
That passion matters, right?
Yep.
That devotion to a cause,
yep.
Right? If abortion's your issue, or gun control, like common sense gun safety, or whatever the issue is, right? That can have an impact, and that money matters too, right? That because the Birchers were well funded.
Yeah.
And I think that the insight really of the past decade, and something that you suggested earlier, that kind of local on the ground energy can also have a much bigger impact than you think, right? Yeah. And that people and the other thing I should add is also facts and reality matter. And now it's much harder to counteract that nowadays for all the obvious reasons, including the proliferation of social media. But I think that those are tensions, if you will, that are fault lines that we saw with the Birch phenomenon in the 60s. And I would offer just a note of hope, too, that institutions also matter. And so the Department of Justice, rounding up, detaining, and then trying, I think, more than 1,000 January 6th insurrectionists, putting them in jail, I think that's had a real impact. And so, the institutions are very wobbly. The guardrails, right, are not quite as tall as they once were, but I think that they are holding in some important ways. But obviously that means that people have to organize, donate, get passion for a cause, and a vote.
Yep. Well, that's what we do here. We remind people to go to vote.org all the time. And we say, first and foremost, democracy, because without the rule of law and those norms, right, we don't have anything.
Yeah.
It's like you said, the guardrails are wobbly, but it's up to us to self-govern, and self-regulate.
Yeah. And last thing I'll say is I think Biden did something which was actually quite, if I can make one semi-partisan comment, quite shrewd, which is in 2020 and also in 2022, gave a series of speeches saying these elections are about democracy in part, and about election denialism. And, in the big lie, and are you going to believe in conspiracy theories, or are you going to vote for, a system where we honor whoever wins, right? A fair vote. And so, that I think remains a central issue, of course, in 2024 and beyond.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, your book, Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right, I think is essential reading now, but should be always. I mean, you've done the main work of reminding people what allegedly Mark Twain once said. It's attributed to him. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And I think your book holds great resonance for that. But it's both an important history, but it's also yet another forewarning of how to combat, like you said, forces that conspire to undo the things that do bind us. Those are our democratic principles. So I really thank you for coming on and for writing the book. And people, please read your Dalek. It's your homework. We got a lot of readers who listen to this, so it's good. So again, Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. Matthew Dalek, thank you for coming on Dirty Moderate.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure talking to you, and thank you again.
Yep, and come back anytime. All right, folks. Thank you. All right, thank you.